Hitler at first refused to discuss the sequence of the operations I was proposing. He would not admit that there really were powerful forces advancing through the area between 1st Panzer Army and Army Detachment Lands. He also feared that the operations I envisaged between the Dnieper and the Donets would become bogged down in the mud. As the winter was already quite far advanced, this was naturally a possibility to be reckoned with. But the main reason for Hitler's negative reaction was most probably the wish to recapture Kharkov at the earliest possible date, which he hoped would be when the SS Panzer Corps had assembled its full complement of divisions. In fact, the situation was such that a prior condition for any stroke in the direction of Kharkov was the removal of the threat to the Dnieper crossings. Unless the communications across this river were kept open, neither 1st Panzer Army nor Army Detachment Hollet could remain alive. For the stroke at Kharkov, moreover, the cooperation of at least a part of 4th Panzer Army would be needed. Since it was certain that when the thaw finally put an end to operations, it would do so in the region between the Donets and Dnieper before it affected the country around and north of Kharkov, one could reasonably hope that we should still have time to attack at Kharkov after we had beaten the enemy now advancing between 1st Panzer Army and Army Detachment Lands. On the other hand, it was more than doubtful whether the two operations could be carried out the other way round. Because of the obstinacy with which Hitler invariably clung to his point of view, another interminable discussion ensued. I finally put an end to it by pointing out that as the SS Panzer Corps must in any case first assemble on the Kharkov-Krasnograd road, which it could not do before 19th February at the earliest, the final decision on whether to go north or south need not be taken till then. This dilatory approach of mine was made possible by the reflection that 4th Panzer Army could not be available before 19th February either. I also felt justified in assuming that Hitler would be brought to reason by the course of events which he was now experiencing at first hand. On 18th of February, I saw Hitler again. The enemy had attacked in strength on the Meuse and penetrated at several places into the as yet unconsolidated front of Army Detachment Hollet. Furthermore, it had still not been possible to destroy the enemy cavalry corps encircled behind this front at Debaltsevo. I submitted to Hitler that in spite of this, it was still urgently necessary to withdraw motorized units from here to the Western Wing, even if it were not possible at that particular moment. The enemy mechanized corps in the deep flank of 1st Panzer Army at Grishino was not yet defeated either, so that the forces committed there were still tied up. On the other hand, there was now incontestable evidence that the enemy in the gap between 1st Panzer Army and Army Detachment Lands was indeed advancing in force against the Dnieper crossings. His 267 Rifle Division had been identified south of Krasnograd, and he had taken Pavlograd with 35 Guards Division, which included a tank battalion. An Italian division located there, one left over from the former Italian army, had hurriedly pulled out on the approach of the enemy. Army Detachment Lance had reported that the wheeled vehicle units of the Death's Head SS Panzer Division were completely bogged down between Kiev and Poltava. This washed out the northward stroke to retake Kharkov, which had been Hitler's primary concern. If the SS Panzer Corps had not even been able to hold the city without the Death's Head Division, it was less likely than ever to recapture it when the latter's availability date could not be anticipated for the time being. The only thing we could do, therefore, was to strike southeastwards and destroy the enemy advancing through the gap between Army Detachment Lance and 1st Panzer Army. Since the thaw must be expected in that area too, in the very near future, there was no time to lose. In the circumstances, Hitler agreed to my idea of immediately committing the Reich Division as the first available formation of the SS Panzer Corps in the direction of Pavlograd. The Leibstandarte Division was to provide 4th Panzer Army's operation with cover against the enemy pushing hard southwards from Kharkov. At all events, it was now to be hoped that 4th Panzer Army, reinforced by the Reich Division, would be successful. Following this decision, I put my view to Hitler on the situation generally. I pointed out that even if we managed, and it was far from certain that we should, To avoid any unfavourable developments until the muddy season set in, I still had to think ahead. The mud would not give us a break of more than a few weeks. After that, the Army Group would have a front of 470 miles to hold, for which, inclusive of the forces of Army Detachment Lands, there were 32 divisions available. On the other hand, it could be taken for granted that once the muddy season was over, the enemy would again direct his main effort against the German southern wing and go all out to encircle it on the Black Sea. A front of 470 miles, defended by only about 30 divisions, I told Hitler, could be pierced by a stronger enemy at any point he liked. Above all, no one could prevent him from steadily outflanking the Army Group to the north until he reached the Sea of Azov or the Black Sea. Once the muddy season finished, therefore, the Army Group must not remain stationary until the enemy broke through somewhere or outflanked it in the north. It could only afford to stay where it was if OKH were able to launch a well-timed offensive stroke to relieve the pressure on the front, which still projected a long way eastwards. My purpose in putting forward these ideas was to persuade Hitler to consider operations on a long-term basis for once. It was obvious, however, that he had no intention whatever of committing himself. While admitting that the Army Group's forces would be too weak to defend that front in the coming year, he would not accept the ratio of strengths I had given him. He did not dispute the presence opposite us of the 341 enemy formations we had identified, but contended that they were no longer of any value. When I objected that our own divisions were also at the end of their tether, he replied that they would be brought fully up to strength and issued with new weapons during the muddy season, which in point of fact they were. He would not recognize, however, that during that same period the enemy would bring his 1926 class of 1.5 million men to the front. Neither would he admit that with the number of tanks the enemy could produce in 2 months, i.e. the approximate duration of the muddy season, he could refit about 60 armoured brigades. Instead, Hitler was at pains to emphasize the decisive importance which the Donetsk area would have for Soviet tank production if it were once to fall back into enemy hands. As for Germany's own conduct of operations in the east in 1943, he could not take the forces for a large offensive from any of the other theatres, nor could he find them from newly drafted units. On the other hand, he did think that it would be possible to take limited and localized action with the help of new weapons. This brought Hitler right back to the subject of weapons and weapon production, and it proved impossible to pin him down on his intentions regarding the coming summer campaign. We lived, it seemed, in 2 entirely different worlds. On 19th February, a further conference took place, and this time Field Marshal versus Kleist had been asked to attend. Apparently, Hitler's stay at my headquarters had quite impressed him after all as to the dangers on the German southern wing, for he announced that Army Group A was henceforth to transfer whatever forces it could possibly spare to Southern Army Group. In his own words, Army Group A would henceforth be regarded as an adjacent reservoir of forces for the Southern Army Group front, which presumably meant that his plan for bringing the Kuban bridgehead back into the operational picture at some later date was now on the shelf. The future was to show, unfortunately, that this reservoir was not to be exploited on anything like the scale which the transport facilities over the Crimea would have allowed. The Kuban bridgehead was to go on living its isolated existence. Experience has long taught that nothing is more difficult than to get forces released from a place once they have been wrongly tied up there. That day tension mounted even higher when the enemy, apparently in considerable strength, reached the railway station of Sinsinikovo. As a result of this, he not only temporarily blocked the main supply line to the centre and right wing of the Army Group, but was also less than 40 miles away from the headquarters in which the Führer of the Reich was staying. As there were no troops whatever on the intervening ground, I was most relieved when Hitler flew home the same afternoon. It was quite conceivable that by the following day the enemy tanks could have denied us the use of our airfield lying east of the Dnieper. The last point I had made to Hitler was that I should need almost all the armoured divisions for the blows I intended delivering on the western wing, which meant they would have to be taken away from the Mius positions. If it had been possible to hold the latter until now, The only reason was that the main body of the enemy forces advancing on them had to pass through the Rostov bottleneck and had not yet arrived. The possibility that the Donetsk area would be taken from the east, therefore, was one which could not be ignored. Nothing could be done to prevent it until we had first removed the danger of the army groups being cut off from its rear communications. This Hitler seemed to grasp. In any case, I had the impression that Hitler's visit to my headquarters had helped to bring home to him the danger of encirclement, which immediately threatened the southern wing of the Eastern Front and would continue to do so for some time to come. In spite of this, a story was soon afterwards circulated by OKW or General Schmundt that the real purpose of Hitler's trip had been to put some backbone into the army group. I am not aware that my headquarters was ever in need of this. Even if we were not prepared to do what Hitler demanded and fight stolidly for every foot of ground, regardless of the consequences of holding on at all costs, I do not think it would be easy to find another headquarters which, in the teeth of so many crises, clung more stubbornly than our own to its will for victory. In this respect, there was never the slightest divergence between my staff and myself. On 19th of February, the Army Group ordered 4th Panzer Army to deploy for its counterattack against the enemy, who had come over the line Pereshchepino-Pavlograd-Grishino to cut off the Army Group from the Dnieper. On 20th of February, the picture of the enemy's operational intentions became completely clear and proved to be exactly as we had anticipated. On our eastern front, the enemy attacked Army Detachment Hollitz's positions on the Mius, breaking through at 3 main points. To cut our communications over the Dnieper, he appeared to have committed, in addition to the forces held up by us at Grishino and Kramatorskaya, an army with a strength of 3 rifle divisions, 2 tank corps and some cavalry. Simultaneously, he was trying to break through the weak front of Army Detachment Kempf, General Lantz having now been relieved by General Kempf, to the west and southwest of Kharkov. Furthermore, he was making a bid to envelop this army detachment on its northwestern wing and, by reaching further north, to outflank it completely. In the face of these developments, the army group had 2 different things to accomplish. It must try to hold the eastern front on the Mius to the best of its ability, though whether it could do so with such limited forces and without any reserves was an open question. Secondly, it must use 4th Panzer Army to bring about the quick defeat of the enemy in between 1st Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf in order to prevent its own isolation from the Dnieper crossings. If it failed in this, most of the army group's forces would shortly be immobilized through a lack of motor fuel. Once it had been possible to beat the enemy force between the Donetsk and Dnieper, it would depend on how the situation had developed in the meantime, whether we could immediately thrust northwards with all our mobile forces in order to restore the position of Army Detachment Kempf. On the other hand, it might first be necessary for 4th Panzer Army to fight another action in the area of 1st Panzer Army if the latter had still not succeeded in dealing on its own with the enemy at Grishino and Kramatorskaya. In any case, we must hold off on our northern wing, i.e. in Army Detachment Kempf's area, for the time being. All that the latter could be given to do at present was to bar the way to the Dnieper, be it through Krasnograd to Dnepropetrovsk or through Poltava to Kremenchug, by putting up the toughest possible resistance. Should the enemy by any chance be aspiring to reach Kiev, and the many signs that he were making Hitler increasingly apprehensive, we could only wish him a pleasant trip. Such a far-flung outflanking movement was hardly likely to achieve any positive results before the muddy season set in. 21st February brought us the first hints of relief on what at present were the army group's most vital stretches of front. The eastern front on the Mius had held. The remnants of the enemy cavalry corps, long surrounded behind it at Debaltsevo, were finally compelled to surrender. An enemy tank corps, which had been encircled after breaking through the Mius front at Matveyev-Kurgan, was also doomed to destruction. On the right wing of 1st Panzer Army, the enemy was maintaining his pressure on the Freta-Pico group, obviously with the object of next unhinging the Mius position or outflanking the northern front of 1st Panzer Army. Opposite the latter, everything remained quiet. Monitored wireless messages made it clear that the Soviet force engaged on the western front of 1st Panzer Army at Grishino and in the Kramatorskaya area, i.e. the Popov Group, was faring badly. Evidently its supplies had broken down. 4th Panzer Army had taken Pavlograd, and there was reason to hope that its last formations would have closed up with the main body before the roads softened. The fact that a not very powerful enemy tank force had thrust close up to Zaporozhye did not now imply any great danger. It ran out of petrol some 12 miles from the town and was duly destroyed piecemeal. Unfortunately, a new division destined for Pavlograd, 332, was diverted to the right wing of Central Army Group by OKH while already on its way up to us. Though Second Army's position was probably not at all rosy, Southern Army Group had a prior claim now that we were finally on the way to regaining the initiative. Whether the enemy made any progress towards Kiev in the meantime was comparatively unimportant. That the enemy did harbour such intentions was shown by the fact that Soviet forces were advancing in considerable strength from the Belgorod direction towards Aktyrka, clearly with a view to getting round the northern flank of Army Detachment Kempf. In the next few days, 4th Panzer Army's counterstroke achieved the success for which we had been hoping. With that, the initiative in this campaign at last passed back to the German side. For a start, the army smashed the forces advancing towards the Dnieper crossings, i.e. those in the area around and south of Pavlograd. What Hitler had refused to accept was now substantiated in that there did prove to be 2 tank, 1 rifle and 1 cavalry corps involved. Immediately afterwards it was possible, in cooperation with 1st Panzer Army, to defeat the 4 enemy tank and mechanised corps opposite its western front. By 1st March it was clear that by reason of his defeats between the Donets and Dnieper, the enemy was also beginning to soften up opposite the northern front of 1st Panzer Army, and that the latter would regain the Donets line in this sector. One felt a strong temptation to chase the enemy across the still frozen river and take him in the rear in and west of Kharkov. To have our hands free to advance across the middle Donets, however, it was first necessary to knock out the southern wing of the enemy's Kharkov group, which was present in force on the Berestovaya, southwest of the city. Whether this could still be done in view of the imminent thaw was more than doubtful. Consequently, the army group had to content itself initially with seeking out and defeating the Kharkov enemy west of the Donets. In the southern strip of the army group's operational area, near to the coast, it had already started to thaw. At the end of February, the enemy on the Memoirs front had given up his attempt to break through with armoured and other mobile formations, and sent in rifle divisions instead. Evidently, he wanted to have at least some bridgeheads west of the river before the mud came. After even this broad assault had failed, his offensive finally degenerated into fruitless local attacks. By 2nd March, the army group was able to survey the results of its first counterblow, delivered by 4th Panzer Army and the left wing of 1st Panzer Army against the enemy between the Donets and Dnieper. In the course of this attack and Army Detachment Holit's successful defensive on the Meuse, the armies of the enemy's southwest front had received such a beating that they were temporarily incapable of further offensive action. Particularly heavy punishment had been meted out to the forces which had driven forward against the left wing of 1st Panzer Army and into the gap between the latter and Army Detachment Kempf, the Soviet 6th Army, the Popov Group, which had fought at Grishino, and 1st Guards Army. The enemy's 25 Tank Corps and 3 rifle divisions could be written off completely, while 3 and 10 Tank Corps and 4 Guards Tank Corps, 1 independent armoured brigade, 1 mechanised brigade, 1 rifle division, and 1 ski brigade were known to have had a severe battering. In addition, heavy losses had been suffered by 1 Guards Tank Corps and 18 Tank Corps, as well as by 6 rifle divisions and 2 ski brigades. According to reports received from our own troops, the enemy had left some 23,000 dead on the Donets-Dnieper battlefield, and the booty included 615 tanks, 354 field pieces, 69 anti-aircraft guns, and large numbers of machine guns and mortars. The figure of 9,000 prisoners appeared small in comparison. The reason for it was that our own forces, most of which were armoured, had not been able to form an unbroken ring round the enemy. Because of the cold, particularly at night, the troops tended to bunch together in and around the villages, with the result that individual Soviet soldiers and units which abandoned their vehicles were left with plenty of room to slip away over the intervening countryside. It had not been possible to block the Donets in the enemy's rear, as it was still icebound and entirely passable to lightly armed troops moving on foot. Apart from the enemy losses already mentioned, 4 Guards mechanized corps, which had been encircled behind the Meuse front, and 7 Guards cavalry corps were also wiped out. After thus regaining the initiative by the victory between the Donets and Dnieper, Southern Army Group proceeded to deliver the stroke against the Voronezh front, i.e., the enemy forces located in the Kharkov area, in accordance with an order already issued on 28th of February. The intention was to attack these forces on their southern flank, with the aim either of turning the latter or, if at all possible, of later driving into the enemy rear from the east. Our object was not the possession of Kharkov, but the defeat, and if possible the destruction, of the enemy units located there. Hence the first priority was to smash the enemy's southern wing, which consisted of 3rd Soviet Tank Army on the Berestovaya southwest of the city. This was achieved by 4th Panzer Army by 5th March. Of 3rd Tank Army, 12 and 4 Tank Corps, a cavalry corps and 3 rifle divisions were partly cut to pieces and partly captured in a small pocket at Krasnograd. While there were once again relatively few prisoners, our own troops put the number of enemy dead at 12,000 and reported the capture of 61 tanks, 225 guns, and 600 motor vehicles. A turn in the weather prevented the Army Group from now moving against the rear of the enemy, harassing Army Detachment Kempf at Akhturka and Poltava, in order to make him fight a battle with reversed front. This would have necessitated 4th Panzer armies crossing the Donets downstream from Kharkov, but the ice was liable to break up at any time, and no pontoon bridges would have held against the drift ice. Even to launch a smaller-scale flanking movement by crossing the Mosh and taking the city, through which the enemy's rear communications ran, from behind hardly seemed feasible now that the ground was thawing out. Thus, an attempt had to be made to roll up the enemy from the flank and to force him away from Kharkov in the process. With this aim in view, 4th Panzer Army, including the SS Panzer Corps, the last formation of which, the Death's Head Division, had meanwhile arrived complete, attacked in a northward direction from the Krasnograd area on 7th of March. Army Detachment Kempf joined in as soon as the enemy began to relax his pressure on its own front. The attack made good progress in the days that followed. By this time, however, the enemy had recognized the threat to his Voronezh front. Our radio monitors ascertained that he was moving what appeared to be several tank and mechanized corps from the Voroshilovgrad area to Isium, presumably for use against the flank of 4th Panzer Army as it drove north of Kharkov. These, however, no longer achieved any notable impression, either because they had expended their offensive capacity in the preceding battles around Voroshilovgrad or on the Meuse, or else because the thawing of the Donets hindered their intervention. All the enemy could do was to win a minor bridgehead northwest of Isium on the south bank of the river. He also fetched 2 Guards Tank Corps up to Kharkov from the east and pulled certain of his forces which had been harassing Army Detachment Kempf's northern wing and 2nd Army back to Bogodukov. As 2nd Army was too weak to go over to the offensive itself, it seemed doubtful whether we should succeed in preventing the forces which had pushed a long way west towards and north of Akhturka from escaping eastwards. Whatever happened, though, we wanted to try to force the enemy facing Army Detachment Kempf further south away from Kharkov, or alternatively to cut him off from the Donets crossings east of the river. If this came off, Kharkov could be taken by a coup de main. At all costs, the Army Group wished to avoid Kharkov's becoming a second Stalingrad, in which our assault forces might become irretrievably committed. It was inevitable, however, that the name of Kharkov should act as a magic stimulus on the fighting troops and less senior command staffs. The SS Panzer Corps, wishing to lay the recaptured city at its Führer's feet as a symbol of victory, was eager to take the shortest route there, so that the army group had to intervene vigorously on more than one occasion to ensure that the Corps did not launch a frontal assault on Kharkov and become tied down there while enemy elements still fighting to the west of the city were able to make good their escape. In the end, it was possible to bring the SS Panzer Corps round to the east. The city fell without difficulty, and we succeeded in cutting off the retreat of considerable numbers of the enemy across the Donets. As has been seen, the enemy had been compelled by developments in the area around and south of Kharkov to thin out his forces opposite Army Detachment Kempf when they were already near to Poltava and in possession of Akhturka further north. Subsequently, he had to move them back towards Kharkov and Belgorod, with Army Detachment Kempf in close pursuit. On 10th March, Hitler paid our headquarters a further visit. In addition to briefing him on the current situation, I dealt in particular with our view of how operations should be conducted at the end of the muddy season, which was now setting in. This will be covered in the next chapter. On 14th March, Kharkov fell to the SS Panzer Corps. At the same time, on the northern wing of Army Detachment Kempf, the Grossdeutschland Division moved swiftly on Belgorod. The enemy once again threw in strong armoured forces to oppose it, but these were wiped out at Gaveron. The capture of Kharkov and Belgorod marked the conclusion of Army Group's second counterblow, as the increasing muddiness of the ground did not permit any further operations. As a matter of fact, the Army Group would have liked to wind up by clearing out, with the help of Central Army Group, the enemy salient extending some distance westwards of Kursk in order to shorten the German front. The scheme had to be abandoned, however, as Central Army Group declared itself unable to cooperate. As a result, the salient continued to constitute a troublesome dent in our front, which left certain openings to the enemy, and at the same time cramped our own operations. Nevertheless, the Army Group was now securely in possession of the entire Donets front from Belgorod, down to where the Mius positions branched off from it. These Donets and Mius fronts together formed the very same line as had been held by German troops in the winter of 1941-2. If, in conclusion, we cast a final glance at the full course and outcome of the 1942-3 winter campaign in South Russia, we must begin by acknowledging the successes attained on the Soviet side, the magnitude of which was incontestable. The Russians had contrived to encircle and destroy the German Sixth Army, the strongest we had in the field. They had, moreover, swept 4 Allied armies clean off the map. Many brave members of the latter had fallen in battle, and considerable numbers had gone into captivity. What Allied troops remained had disintegrated, and had sooner or later to be withdrawn for good from the zone of operations. Even though it was possible to reconstitute the majority of Sixth Army's divisions from residual units and replacements, and for Army Detachment Hollet to assume the designation of Sixth Army in March 1943, the loss of the bulk of the fighting troops of 20 divisions, besides a considerable proportion of the Army artillery and engineers, was quite irreparable. And limited though the fighting efficiency of the Allied armies might be, their loss was still a considerable one, depriving us as it did of a substitute for German forces on quiet sectors of the front. Yet despite the disappearance of 5 whole armies from the German order of battle, no one can say that this alone need have decisively influenced the outcome of the war. It was accompanied by the loss of the whole of the immense territories we had won in the 1942 summer offensive, together with their natural resources. The grab for the Caucasian oil fields, one of the fundamental aims of that offensive, had failed to come off. And here we may note that this economic goal, on which Göring had been so insistent, decisively contributed to the offensive's split. In their pursuit of this economic objective, people had forgotten that its attainment and retention always depended on defeating the main body of the enemy forces. All the same, it had still been possible to hold the part of the Donets Basin that was essential to the conduct of the war. But great though their gains undoubtedly were, the Russians had still not succeeded in winning their decisive victory over the German southern wing, the destruction of which could probably never have been made good by our side. By the end of the winter campaign, the initiative was back in German hands, and the Russians had suffered 2 defeats. Though not decisive in character, these did lead to a stabilization of the front and offer the German command a prospect of fighting the war in the east to a draw. Nevertheless, we could clearly bury any hope of changing the course of the war by an offensive in the summer of 1943. Our loss of fighting power had already been far too great for anything of that order. The obvious inference for the Supreme Command to draw was that it must strive with every means at its disposal to come to terms with at least one of Germany's opponents. Similarly, it must realize the need to base its subsequent conduct of the war in the East on a policy of sparing its own forces, particularly by avoiding the loss of entire armies, as at Stalingrad, while seeking to wear down the offensive capacity of the enemies. To that end, resolutely ignoring all secondary aspirations, it must switch the main effort to the Eastern theatre for as long as Germany's Western adversaries were unable to land in France or to deliver a critical blow from the Mediterranean area. If we now return to the 1942-3 winter offensive and its outcome, the next question to ask is why the Soviet command, despite its big successes in this campaign, did not achieve the decisive success of annihilating the whole of the German southern wing. After all, with that overwhelming number of formations and the operational advantages it possessed at the outset, it had the highest possible trumps to play. It must be emphasized for a start that the Soviet command showed no lack of aggressive spirit and engaged its troops without the least regard for casualties in order to attain its objectives. The troops themselves, as was almost invariably true of the Russians, fought with great bravery and at times made unbelievable sacrifices. Nonetheless, there was an unmistakable fall-off in the quality of the infantry, and the losses of artillery in 1941-2 had still not been made good. Since the beginning of the war, the Soviet leaders had unquestionably learnt a great number of lessons, especially regarding the organization and use of large armoured formations. Although the enemy had possessed large numbers of tanks as early as 1941, he had not known then how to use them as individual members of a united whole. By now he had them properly organized in his tank and mechanized corps, and had also taken over the German technique of penetration in depth. In spite of this, we almost always succeeded, except in the situation of November 1942, in ultimately beating or destroying these tank and mechanized formations, even when they had already driven deep into the German forward areas. After the encirclement of Sixth Army, on the other hand, they were never again able to drive through to vital spots with such speed and in such strength as to fulfill the aim of cutting off the German southern wing, whether on the Don, the coast of the Sea of Azov, or the lower Dnieper. Except for Stalingrad, where Hitler gave it the opportunity, the Soviet command was never able to bring about a battle of encirclement, as we had done on various occasions in 1941, taking several thousand prisoners in the process. This held good in spite of the Russians' enormous preponderance of forces in the winter of 1942-3, and the fact that the opening situation and the collapse of the Allied armies afforded them a free passage into the rear of the German front. We, on the other hand, had had to fight a mainly frontal battle in 1941. So let us take a look at the Soviet leadership at the top. In view of the operational situation that existed at the end of the German summer offensive, the strategic aim of encircling the German southern wing was so palpably evident that it could not possibly be overlooked. The idea of breaking through the fronts of the Allied armies was also a very obvious move. In other words, not very much genius was required on the Soviet side to draft an operations plan in the late autumn of 1942. The first stroke, the encirclement of Sixth Army, was undoubtedly correct. If it succeeded, and the German Supreme Command did everything to see that it did, the strongest striking force the Germans had would be eliminated. It would have been better if this first blow had been coordinated with the offensive against the fronts of the Italian and Hungarian armies, in order that every effort should be made from the start to cut off the German forces at Rostov or on the Sea of Azov in one unified and large-scale assault operation. Clearly, the available artillery was not equal to the task, and for this reason, presumably, the breakthrough operations had to be staggered. It is also conceivable that the transport situation did not allow the sum total of assault forces to be assembled and supplied simultaneously. However, the unexpectedly swift and complete collapse of the Allied armies on our own side compensated the Soviets to a great extent for the inconveniences which this staggering of the three breakthrough offensives entailed. When the Soviet command failed to accomplish its mission of tying off the German southern wing on the lower Don, the Sea of Azov, or in the last instance the Dnieper, the reason was certainly not that its offensive was necessarily bound to get bogged down in that extensive zone of operations. When considered by the standards of modern warfare, the distances to be covered by the Soviet assault groups to their various objectives were by no means excessive, nor were the German reserves which were thrown in to meet them so strong that the Soviet offensive need have come to a standstill short of its decisive objectives and have ultimately ended in a serious reverse. On the contrary, one must say that, with the exception of Stalingrad, the Soviet command never managed to coordinate strength and speed when hitting a decisive spot. In the first phase of the winter campaign, it undoubtedly tied down unnecessarily large forces against Sixth Army in order to make doubly sure of its prize. In doing so, it let slip the chance to cut off the German southern wing's supply lines on the lower Don. The forces that attacked the Cheer front were certainly strong, but they did not act in concert. After the breakthrough on the Italian front, the Soviet command similarly failed to stake everything on quickly crossing the Donets and reaching Rostov. With such far-reaching objectives involved, there was admittedly a danger that the Russians would later be attacked in the flank themselves, but they should have expected to derive the necessary protection here from the offensive due to be launched on the Hungarian front immediately afterwards. Risky, I agree, but anyone who is not prepared to take such risks will never achieve decisive and, as was essential in this case, speedy results. Even after the successful breakthrough against the Hungarian army, which tore open the German front from the Donets to Voronezh, the Soviet command still failed to press on with sufficient speed and strength in the decisive direction, towards the Dnieper crossings. Instead of putting all its eggs in one basket and simply leaving a strong, concentrated shock group to provide offensive protection to the west, it squandered its forces in a series of far-ranging uncoordinated thrusts at Akhterka and Poltava by way of Kursk, against the Dnieper, and across the Donets line Slavyansk, Lysychensk, Voroshilovgrad. In this way it enabled the German command to be stronger at the decisive spots when the time came. Schlieffen once said that both sides in a battle or campaign, the loser just as much as the winner, contribute to the outcome by the various actions they take. The German Supreme Command's share of responsibility for the loss of Sixth Army, and indeed for the whole crisis which arose on the southern wing of the Eastern Front in the winter of 1942-3, has already been plainly stated. It is thus only fair to mention what contribution the German side made to the Russians' ultimate failure to encircle the German southern wing. In this respect, only one thing need be said. But for the almost superhuman achievements of the German troops and their commanders in facing up to an enemy many times their superior in numbers, the army group could never have succeeded in bringing its defeat underfoot. This winter campaign could never have been fought had not our brave infantry divisions, unlike the troops of our allies, and often without adequate anti-tank defences, stood firm before the assaults of the enemy's armoured formations, and, by closing the front behind his tanks whenever they broke through, ensured their ultimate destruction. A similar debt was owed to our Panzer divisions, which fought with unparalleled versatility and more than doubled their effectiveness by the way they dodged from one place to the next. The German fighting troops, convinced of their superiority as soldiers, stood their ground in the most desperate situations, and their courage and self-sacrifice did much to compensate for the enemy's numerical preponderance. One thing must not be forgotten. It was the valiant Sixth Army which, by loyally fighting on to the last, snatched the palm of an annihilating victory against the German southern wing from the enemy's hand. Had it, instead of resisting till early February, given up the struggle as soon as its position became hopeless, the Russians could have thrown in such an extra weight of forces at the crucial spots that their aim to encircle the whole southern wing of the German front would most probably have been achieved. Such was Sixth Army's vital contribution to our success in once more stabilising the situation on the Eastern Front in March 1943. Though the self-sacrifice of the men of Sixth Army may have been in vain so far as the final outcome of the war was concerned, this can never annul its moral worth. That is why, now that we have come to the end of the chapter, the name of Sixth Army is to shine forth for one last time. This army fulfilled the highest demand that can ever be made on a soldier, to fight on to the last in a hopeless situation for the sake of his comrades. The preceding chapter has shown that the winter campaign of 1942-3, which had start CD with the Russian breakthrough on the Don and Volga on both sides of Stalingrad, did not ultimately bring the Soviet command the decisive operational success for which it might have hoped. The question now was how the German side should continue the struggle the following summer. Obviously, after so many major formations had been lost, there would no longer be the forces available to mount another crucial offensive on the scale of 1941 and 1942. What did still seem possible, given proper leadership on the German side, was that the Soviet Union could be worn down to such an extent that it would tire of its already excessive sacrifices and be ready to accept a stalemate. At the time in question, this was far from being wishful thinking. On the other hand, such an aim could not be realized by going over to purely defensive, static warfare. For one thing, there were not enough German divisions to defend the far-flung front from the Baltic to the Black Sea decisively. For another, it was unlikely that the Soviets would take any action until the Western Allies landed in Europe, the danger of which had become all the more acute in the light of recent events in North Africa. The German command thus had very little time left in which to force a draw in the east. It could only do so if it succeeded within the framework of a, now inevitable, strategic defensive, in dealing the enemy powerful blows of a localized character which would sap his strength to a decisive degree, first and foremost through losses in prisoners. This presupposed an operational elasticity on our part, which would give maximum effect to the still superior quality of the German command staffs and fighting troops. We naturally had to consider what action the Soviet command would take once the muddy season was over. Would Stalin wait until his allies had met his repeated demands for a landing on the European mainland? Though it seemed very natural that he should do so, there were still many arguments against it. Soviet self-confidence had undoubtedly increased since the big successes late in the previous autumn. Could the Soviet leaders possibly afford, from a psychological point of view, to call a halt to their loudly advertised liberation of the holy soil of Russia? Must the Kremlin not be anxious to beat its allies to the Balkans, the traditional target of Russian expansionism? Assuming that the enemy resumed the offensive as soon as he had made good his losses, therefore, it seemed certain that he would continue to direct the main pressure of his attacks against the southern wing of the German front, i.e. against Southern Army Group. The bulge in the German front, which ran down the Donets and Meuse from a point below Kharkov, embracing the valuable coal mining and industrial regions south of that city, was just begging to be sliced off. Should the enemy succeed in breaking through around Kharkov, or even across the middle Donets, he could still achieve his aim of the previous winter and destroy the German southern wing on the Black Sea coast. At this time, Army Group A was still in the Kuban bridgehead. By the same stroke, he would regain possession of the precious Donets area and the granaries of Ukraine, in addition to opening the way to the Balkans and Romanian oil fields, with all the political consequences this would have entailed in regard to Turkey. In no other sector of the Eastern Front was the Soviet Union offered such immense opportunities in the military, economic or political fields. The decisive thrust, then, would be delivered against Southern Army Group, a fact which, in view of the Russians' numerical superiority, naturally did not exclude the possibility of smaller-scale offensives in other parts of the front. Southern Army Group had on a number of occasions brought these considerations to the notice of OKH and Hitler. What the latter ultimately had to decide was whether the overall situation allowed us to wait for the Russians to start an offensive and then to hit them hard on the backhand at the first good opportunity, or whether we should attack as early as possible ourselves and, still within the framework of a strategic defensive, strike a limited blow on the forehand. The Army Group preferred the former solution as one offering better prospects operationally, and had already submitted a tentative plan to Hitler in February. It envisaged that if the Russians did as we anticipated and launched a pincer attack on the Donetsk area from the north and south, an operation which could sooner or later be supplemented by an offensive around Kharkov, our arc of front along the Donetsk and Memoirs should be given up in accordance with an agreed timetable to draw the enemy westwards towards the lower Dnieper. Simultaneously, all the reserves that could possibly be released, in particular the bulk of the armour, were to assemble in the area west of Kharkov, first to smash the enemy assault forces, which we expected to find there, and then to drive into the flank of those advancing in the direction of the lower Dnieper. In this way, the enemy would be doomed to suffer the same fate on the coast of the Sea of Azov as he had in store for us on the Black Sea. The plan did not meet with Hitler's approval, however. He was still preoccupied with the economic aspects of the Donetsk basin and apprehensive about the possible repercussions of an even temporary evacuation on the attitudes of Turkey and Romania. But what probably did most to prejudice him was his belief that we must fight for every foot of the ground he had won from Stalin in the winter of 1941, and which had, in his view, saved the German army from a Napoleonic retreat. Besides this, however, he undoubtedly shrank from the risks which the proposed operation would assuredly entail. Inwardly, perhaps, he did not trust himself to cope with them, for in spite of having a certain eye for tactics, he still lacked the ability of a great captain. Consequently, our minds now turned to the idea of a forehand stroke. An attempt must be made to strike the enemy a blow of limited scope before he could recover from his losses in the winter campaign and resuscitate his beaten forces. A suitable target was presented by the Soviet salient, which protruded far into our own front line around the city of Kursk. The Russians, facing the boundary between Central and Southern Army groups, had been able to retain this when the muddy season set in, and it now formed a jumping-off position for any attacks they might be contemplating against the flanks of the two German army groups. The appreciable Soviet forces inside the salient would be cut off if our attack were successful, and provided that we launched it early enough, we could hope to catch them in a state of unpreparedness. In particular, the enemy would have to commit the armoured units which had been so severely battered towards the end of the winter campaign, thereby giving us a chance to punish them wholesale. And so we come to Operation Citadel, the last major offensive operation undertaken by the Germans in the east. For this attack against the Kursk Bulge, Southern Army Group provided two armies, 4th Panzer and Detachment Kempf, comprising 11 armoured or Panzer Grenadier divisions and 5 infantry. In order to do so, of course, it had to thin out the Donetsk and Meuse fronts considerably. For the attack from the north, Central Army Group provided 9th Army, consisting of 6 armoured or Panzer Grenadier divisions and 5 infantry. The principal danger here lay in the armies having to assemble in the salient jutting out to the east around Orel, where the enemy might attack it in the rear from the east and north. Operation Citadel was timed to start in the first half of May, when the ground could be expected to have dried out sufficiently, and the enemy would still not have finished refitting, especially his armour. At the beginning of May, however, Hitler decided, against the advice of the two army group commanders, to postpone Citadel till June, by which time he hoped our armoured divisions would be stronger still after being fitted out with new tanks. He stuck to his decision even after it had been pointed out to him that the unfavourable developments in Tunisia could mean that if Citadel were put off any longer, there would be a danger of its coinciding with an enemy landing on the continent. Nor would he recognise that the longer one waited, the more armour the Russians would have, particularly as their tank output undoubtedly exceeded that of Germany. As a result of delays in the delivery of our own new tanks, the Army Group was not ultimately able to move off on Citadel until the beginning of July, by which time the essential advantage of a forehand blow was lost. The whole idea had been to attack before the enemy had replenished his forces and got over the reverses of the winter. At the same time, it was certain that the longer we took to launch the operation, the greater must be the threat to those of Southern Army Group's armies in the Donetsk-Mius salient, which had had to hand over all their available forces, and most of all, to the Oral Bulge as the jumping-off base of Central Army Group's 9th Army. On 5th July, the German armies were finally able to attack. Though every deception and camouflage measure had been taken, we could no longer expect to catch the enemy unawares after a delay of that length. On the assault front of Central Army Group, 9th Army succeeded in penetrating the enemy fortifications to a depth of about 9 miles in the first 2 days. After heavy fighting in which it had to beat off counterattacks by enemy reserves, it managed to deepen this penetration by a few more miles up till 9th July, but then it came to a halt before a built-in system of positions on a dominant height to the rear of the front. Its intention of resuming the attack in a few days' time was frustrated by the enemy, who attacked the Oral Bulge in strength from the north and northeast on 11th of July. To support 2nd Panzer Army in holding this front, the Army Group found itself compelled to throw strong mobile forces from 9th Army into the Oral battle. The offensive in Southern Army Group's area developed more favourably. Here, too, the attack through the enemy's deeply echeloned defences proved difficult enough and made only slow progress. However, by nth July it had been possible to break through the last position into the area of Prokhorovka and Oboyan. During this time, hasty counterattacks by the enemy's mobile reserves were beaten off, in the course of which 10 tank or mechanised corps were either smashed or severely battered. By 13th of July, the enemy facing Southern Army Group had lost 24,000 men as prisoners, 1 to 800 tanks, 267 field pieces, and 1,080 anti-tank guns. On 13th of July, when the battle was at its climax and the issue apparently at hand, the commanders of the 2 army groups concerned were summoned to Hitler. He opened the conference by announcing that the Western Allies had landed in Sicily that day and that the situation there had taken an extremely serious turn. The Italians were not even attempting to fight, and the island was likely to be lost. Since the next step might well be a landing in the Balkans or Lower Italy, it was necessary to form new armies in Italy and the Western Balkans. These forces must be found from the Eastern Front, so Citadel would have to be discontinued. Thus the very thing had come to pass of which I had warned Hitler in May. The commander of Central Army Group, Field Marshal Verser-Klug, reported that 9th Army was making no further headway and that he was having to deprive it of all its mobile forces to check the enemy's deep incursions into the Oral salient. There could be no question of continuing with Citadel or of resuming the operation at a later date. Speaking for my own army group, I pointed out that the battle was now at its culminating point, and that to break it off at this moment would be tantamount to throwing a victory away. On no account should we let go of the enemy until the mobile reserves he had committed were completely beaten. Nonetheless, Hitler ruled that Citadel was to be called off on account of the situation in the Mediterranean and the state of affairs in Central Army Group. The only concession he would make was that Southern Army Group should continue the attack until it had achieved its aim of smashing the enemy's armoured reserves. As a matter of fact, not even this could be accomplished, for only a few days later the Army Group was ordered to hand over several armoured divisions to Central Army Group. The assault groups of both formations had to be withdrawn to their original start lines, and so the last German offensive in the east ended in a fiasco, even though the enemy opposite the 2 attacking armies of Southern Army Group had suffered 4 times their losses in prisoners, dead and wounded. When Citadel was called off, the initiative in the Eastern theatre of war finally passed to the Russians. Now that we had failed to encircle strong forces of the enemy in the Kursk salient, and had even had to cut short the action against his mobile reserves before anything decisive could be achieved, his preponderance of numbers was bound to make itself felt. Indeed, his attack on the Oral Bulge was only the prelude to a grand offensive. Henceforth, Southern Army Group found itself waging a defensive struggle which could not be anything more than a system of improvisations and stopgaps. Being too weak on that widely extended front for purely passive defence against an enemy so many times stronger than itself, it had to concentrate its efforts, even at the risk of repercussions in sectors temporarily less threatened, on punctually assembling forces wherever there was a Soviet breakthrough to intercept or a chance of inflicting a blow on the enemy. What had to be avoided at all costs was that any elements of the Army Group should become cut off through deep enemy breakthroughs and suffer the same fate as 6th Army at Stalingrad. To maintain ourselves in the field, and in doing so to wear down the enemy's offensive capacity to the utmost, became the whole essence of this struggle. As had been expected, the enemy's first blow was directed against the front embracing the Donetsk area. On 17th July, a powerful offensive was launched against 6th Army on the Memoirs and 1st Panzer Army on the Middle Donetsk. While achieving considerable penetration, however, the enemy was unable to force a breakthrough. 6th Army, by committing both the mechanized formations left as reserves in the Donetsk area, was able to halt the attack after the enemy had won a bridgehead 12 miles wide and 10 miles deep on the west bank of the Meuse north of Kuibyshev. In the case of 1st Panzer Army, the enemy succeeded in crossing the Donetsk southeast of Isium on roughly a 20-mile front, but by throwing in both the divisions of 24 Panzer Corps moving up from Kharkov, it was possible to prevent him from gaining any further ground south of the river. Even though we were able to halt these Soviet attacks by the end of July, however, the situation in the Donetsk area was still hardly tenable from a long-term point of view, and so, having itself had to call off the Citadel operation for good on 17th of July on orders from Hitler, Southern Army Group decided to withdraw a substantial weight of armour from that wing for the time being in order to iron things out in the Donetsk area. We hoped to have given the enemy so much punishment in the course of Citadel that we could now count on a breathing space in this part of the front. Without a doubt, this decision was a disastrous one in regard to subsequent events on the Army Group's northern wing, as the enemy took the offensive there earlier than we had expected. But mistaken though the move proved to be, the fact remains that it was conditioned by Hitler's insistence on holding the Donetsk area. In practice, moreover, the temporary weakening of the northern wing was limited to the withdrawal of HQ 3 Panzer Corps and 3 Panzer Division, since Hitler again put the SS Panzer Corps, now earmarked for Italy, at the Army Group's disposal for this one counterstroke in the Donetsk area. In view of the fact that the 2 corps headquarters and 4 armoured divisions destined for the Donetsk area could only arrive one after the other, the Army Group proposed that the 2 leading divisions of the SS Corps should first deliver a short, sharp punch to straighten out 1st Panzer Army's position south of the Donetsk. Thereupon, the whole of our armour would be used to wipe out the big enemy bridgehead in 6th Army's sector and to restore the Meuse front. Hitler, however, promptly banned any action in 1st Panzer Army's area, although there was not the least reason why this need have protracted the stay of the SS Corps. Since there had already been a case of interference in the Army Group's handling of operations during Citadel, i.e., when Hitler had stopped 24 Panzer Corps from being used with Army Detachment Kempf, I felt compelled to protest to OKH. This is what I wrote to General Zeitzler. If my misgivings about coming developments are disregarded, and if my intentions as a commander, which aim merely at removing difficulties for which I am not responsible, continue to be frustrated, I shall have no choice but to assume that the Führer has not the necessary confidence in this headquarters. I am far from believing myself infallible. Everyone makes mistakes, even great captains like Frederick and Napoleon. At the same time, I would point out that the 11th Army won the Crimean campaign under very difficult conditions, and that when faced with an almost hopeless situation at the end of last year, the Southern Army Group still mastered it. If the Führer thinks he can find any Army Group commander or headquarters staff with better nerves than we had during the past winter, with more initiative than we showed in the Crimea, on the Donets or at Kharkov, with greater powers of improvisation than were displayed by us in the Crimean or Winter Campaign, or with the ability to foresee the inevitable more clearly than we have done, I am fully prepared to hand over to them. As long as I remain at this post, however, I must have the chance to use my own head. July 30th saw the start of the counter-attack launched in the 6th Army's area by the armour brought over from the northern wing of the Army Group. It resulted in the complete restoration of the situation on the Memoirs front. The ratio of forces involved in this battle was indicative not only of the situation obtaining at the time, but also of the superior quality of the German troops. In his bridgehead, the enemy had no less than 16 rifle divisions, 2 mechanized corps, 1 armoured brigade, and 2 anti-tank brigades. The German counter-attack was performed by 4 armoured, 1 Panzer grenadier, and 2 infantry divisions. In the course of this counter-attack and the Soviet attacks preceding it, the enemy lost some 18,000 men as prisoners, 700 tanks, 200 field guns, and 400 anti-tank guns. Having thus succeeded in restoring the situation in the 6th Army's sector, we were still left with the festering wound on the 1st Panzer Army's Donets front. It could no longer be cauterized because of the storm now brewing over the Army Group's northern wing. From the moment when Army Detachment Kempf and 4th Panzer Army were withdrawn to their pre-citadel positions, the enemy had been putting them under steady pressure. Around the turn of the month, our radio monitoring and air reconnaissance showed him to be assembling a strong concentration of armour in the Kursk salient, obviously by bringing fresh forces over from the centre of the Eastern Front. Other offensive preparations were also noticed in the Donets Bend southeast of Kharkov. On August 2nd, we informed OKH that we were expecting an immediate offensive against the Army Group's northern front west of Belgorod.